Priestley uses the character of Mrs Birling to criticise the inequalities of the class system evident within Edwardian society.
One of the ways Priestley criticises the class system is through the negative depiction of Mrs Birling as bossy and controlling. We read in the opening stage directions that Mrs Birling is her husband's social superior, and much of the initial dialogue afforded to her character is based on controlling and reprimanding the actions of others. On screen are a few examples taken from just the opening 5 pages of Act 1, where we see Mrs Birling directing or controlling other characters. Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. Now, Sheila, don't tease him. Now stop it, you two. Arthur, what about this famous toast of yours? I don't think you ought to talk business on an occasion like this. I think Sheila and I had better go into the drawing room and leave you men. Don't keep Gerald in here too long. Eric, I want you a minute. Yes, Priestley immediately presents Mrs Birling as a controlling and demanding character. Much of her time is spent obsessed with actions that might give a bad impression, presumably to Gerald, who is at this point the only character on stage from outside the family. Priestley establishes Mrs Birling as bossy and controlling at the start of the play in order to set up the inevitable conflict with Inspector Gould when he arrives. In Act 2, Mrs Birling complains that Inspector Gould's comments are a trifle impertinent, and in Act 3 she describes his questioning as peculiar and offensive. She is clearly used to having her own way and cannot understand why she's unable to order the police inspector around. Priestley uses Mrs Birling's discomfort to having a police inspector refuse to obey her as an example of the wealthy middle and upper classes' complacency when it comes to the law. Both Mr and Mrs Birling name drop people they know in the police, expecting Inspector Gould to give them an easier time. When people use their connections to avoid prosecution, we call this corruption. Mr and Mrs Birling clearly see themselves as above the law, and they struggle when faced with someone who is moral and insisting that justice is served. Priestley uses Mrs Birling as a dramatic device to develop tension. Of all the characters, it is Mrs Birling who is the most resistant to confess her connection to Eva Smith. Mr Birling and Sheila explain their link as soon as they realise they know her. Gerald attempts to lie to Inspector Gould, but almost immediately thinks better of it and confesses, but Mrs Birling lies outright for 2 pages, no, why should I, before finally admitting she recognises Eva. However, even once Inspector Gould has prized this admission out of her, Mrs Birling defends herself and dodges questions until the very end of Act 2. The effect of writing her dialogue in this way is that the audience is waiting for the total confession, and both tension and frustration are slowly building with every rebuff and refusal to answer. Mrs Birling seems to embody here everything Priestley disliked about the behaviour of the middle and upper class women of Edwardian society. In his radio show, Priestley spoke about women who, after the war, were more concerned about their own lives than helping others. He described how he received bitter letters from ladies doing nothing in inland resorts, where their energy is all turned inward instead of outward, turning into hostility instead of helpfulness and fun. Mrs Birling shares many characteristics with these women, and Priestley uses her as an example of how petty and self-centred or egocentric some people can be when they themselves live easy and comfortable lives, whilst others are struggling to eat. The situation for women like Eva Smith was made worse by the lack of support from the government. In 1912, there was no NHS, no benefit system, and no access to contraception. Therefore, women were reliant upon charities to help them cope when they were struggling. Priestley uses the charity committee who were swayed by Mrs Birling's prejudice to demonstrate how fallible this system was. It's also worth thinking about why someone like Mrs Birling helped out on a charity committee at all. Mrs Birling makes her opinions of the working classes clear. They will lie, they will accept stolen money, and they are to blame for their own situation. If Mrs Birling has such a low opinion of the people she's meant to be helping, why is she involved in the charity? We can infer that her ulterior motive to work on the committee has more to do with how it looks to chair such a committee and to wield power, rather than be driven by the desire to help other people. Priestley presents another sign of Mrs Birling's privilege in the reference to bells and the presence of Edna. Mrs Birling tells Edna she will ring from the drawing room, and this system of bells for maids had fallen out of common usage by 1945. Priestley famously claimed in 1927 that the practice of having domestic servants was as obsolete as the horse. The Birling family's use of domestic staff highlights the old ways of doing things, where working class women were made to work in difficult conditions for very little money. the increase of opportunities to work in other industries, and the outbreak of war, as well as developments in technology that meant housework was easier to perform, all meant that by 1945 the presence of domestic staff had greatly diminished in middle-class homes. Priestley's inclusion of Edna and Mrs Birling's ordering her about emphasises how out of date the Birlings are and how archaic their thinking is. The notion of being privileged runs through the play. Characters who are apparently unaware of their privilege take advantage of other characters who are less privileged than themselves. Priestley questions the morality of Edwardian society through his depiction of a privileged family and their attitudes towards others who are less fortunate than themselves.
Everything I go through in this video series can be found in the second, updated edition of Mr Bruff's Guide to an Inspector Calls, and you can pick up a copy through following the links in the description. If you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.